The morning of September 10th, 1944, near the German border town of Roetgen, the mist clung low to the shattered pines. From the ridgeline, Sergeant William H. Brannan of the 99th Combat Engineer Battalion could barely see the grey concrete lump ahead, a pillbox half buried in earth, its steel embrasure staring blankly down the muddy road like the eye of a bunker-born beast. The men had nicknamed it the Dragon's Tooth, though it was only one of hundreds that studded the western frontier of the Reich. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Brannan adjusted the straps of his helmet, glanced back toward the column behind him, a line of MV Sherman tanks, 2 half-tracks, and, strangely, a Caterpillar D7 bulldozer coated in camouflage paint. The dozer's blade was dented and scarred, its driver perched behind a steel cage welded on in England months before. No one envied his job. "Never thought we'd be bringing farm gear to Germany," muttered Private Levine, wiping grime from his face. Brannan didn't answer. He was listening for the faint, hollow echo that meant the bunker's crew was still alive, still defiant, waiting for Americans to try their luck with another frontal charge. The engineers had tried everything over the past week. TNT satchel charges, bazookas, even tank guns at point-blank range. Nothing made a dent in that pillbox. The order had come down the night before from division headquarters: clear the road to Aachen by dawn. The infantry couldn't advance until the bunkers along the Siegfried Line were neutralized. Conventional fire hadn't worked. Now, someone in command, perhaps inspired by the desperate improvisations of Normandy, had decided to try something unorthodox. The bulldozer would lead the assault. To understand how absurd that sounded in 1944, one has to remember what a bulldozer represented before the war. It wasn't a weapon. It was a symbol of construction, of farms and roads and civilian progress, a machine that moved earth, not empires. In 1939, when German propagandists broadcast their vision of technological mastery, they spoke of panzers and Stukas, of the sleek marriage of steel and ideology. Engineering for them was an instrument of domination. The American engineer, by contrast, was an afterthought, a builder, not a warrior. Even within the US Army, the Corps of Engineers had long been treated as a support branch. They bridged rivers, built airstrips, and cleared mines. They did not attack enemy fortifications directly. That was the infantry's job. But the Second World War would erase such boundaries in the most unexpected ways. By the late summer of 1944, the Allies had burst out of Normandy, raced across France, and stood at the threshold of the German border. What they found there was unlike anything they had faced in the West before the West Wall, known to the Allies as the Siegfried Line, stretching roughly 300 miles from the Dutch frontier to Switzerland. The line consisted of over 18,000 bunkers, pillboxes, and obstacles. Concrete teeth rising from the soil, interlocking machine gun nests, and artillery positions embedded in the hills. Many had been poured as early as 1938, when Hitler feared a French offensive. Though incomplete and outdated in some sectors, the fortifications exploited one timeless military truth: a man in concrete is worth many in the open. American units, accustomed to fluid maneuver warfare, suddenly found themselves facing static, hardened defences reminiscent of the First World War. In theory, the Allies possessed overwhelming firepower. In practice, that firepower often bounced harmlessly off reinforced concrete. The thickest bunkers had walls over 5 feet, thick, steel-reinforced and sloped to deflect shells. Standard demolition charges rarely cracked them. The only sure method was to seal them to choke the pillbox in its own rubble, and that was where the bulldozer came in. The American Caterpillar D7, developed before the war for civilian construction, had proven invaluable during the North African and Italian campaigns. Engineers used it to clear minefields, push wrecks off roads, and build causeways through swamp and rubble. It was slow, unarmoured, and utterly unglamorous, but it could move the world if given time. In Sicily, in 1943, an enterprising officer of the 39th Engineer Regiment had discovered that a D-7 could shove aside anti-tank obstacles faster than explosives could remove them. The lesson spread quietly. Brute force sometimes outperformed finesse. By the time of Normandy, hundreds of bulldozers had been modified with improvised armor plates, scrap steel, boilerplate, even cut-up German tank armor to protect the driver from small arms fire. These armored dozers, as the men called them, became a distinct silhouette on the beaches of June 6, 1944. Some cleared beach exits under fire, others dragged wounded men to safety behind their blades. The dozer crews learned early what every infantryman already knew. The line between combatant and labourer no longer existed. When the push toward Germany began in September, those same engineer units were attached directly to frontline infantry divisions. Their mission was simple on paper and murderous in practice: keep the advance moving, whatever the terrain, whatever the obstacles. Inside the German bunkers, the perception was entirely different. For months, Wehrmacht engineers had reassured their commanders that the Siegfried Line could withstand anything short of a heavy siege. Each pillbox was self-contained, with its own air system, ammunition racks, and escape tunnel. The interlocking arcs and of fire meant that to attack one was to provoke all. Propaganda reinforced this faith. German newsreels, in 1944, portrayed the West Wall as a wall of destiny, das Bollwerk des Reiches. Posters showed smiling soldiers beneath slogans like "Hinter uns steht die Heimat," "Behind us stands the homeland." The implication was clear: this was the last shield against chaos. To the soldiers manning those concrete shells, the idea of Americans bringing construction machinery into battle would have seemed laughable. They imagined their enemies as mechanized but conventional tanks, artillery, infantry. A bulldozer belonged in a quarry, not on a battlefield, but as Sergeant Brannan crouched in the mud that September morning, he was preparing to prove otherwise. The assault began with the usual overture. Artillery thudding in the distance, the air thick with cordite. The dozer's engine coughed, then roared to life, its exhaust curling blue against the drizzle. The driver, a 23-year-old from Iowa, named Corporal James "Red" Anderson, gripped the levers with grease-stained hands. Someone had painted a crude white star on the blade. Beneath it, in chalk, was scrawled Hitler's landscaper. When the signal flare arced overhead, Anderson pushed the throttle forward. The machine lurched into motion, treads biting mud, blade angled slightly upward. German machine guns opened at once, a rippling chatter that sparked against the armoured plates. Bullets pinged like rain on a tin roof. Behind him, infantry advanced in short bursts, using the dozer as moving cover. Brannan followed, carrying a satchel charge slung over his shoulder. He could see the pillbox clearly now, its embrasure spitting flame, its concrete walls scarred but intact. Anderson reached the base of the bunker, dropped the blade, and began to push. The earth groaned. Chunks of wet soil and stone heaved upward, piling against the bunker's firing slit. German. Gunners shouted, their voices muffled. The machine kept pushing, the blade biting deeper, heavier. Within minutes the embrasure was buried, the pillbox sealed beneath a mound of earth. Silence followed, sudden, absolute. Then Brannan heard it. The dull thud of explosions inside, muffled cries, then nothing. The bulldozer reversed slowly, its engine idling. The road to Roetgen was open. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. For the Americans who witnessed that moment, the effect was almost comical. The mighty fortifications of the Reich neutralized not by high explosives or tactical genius, but by a piece of farm machinery. Yet within that absurdity lay something profound. What the Germans had built as a monument to technical supremacy was undone by practical improvisation, by the kind of thinking that valued results over rhetoric. The Siegfried Line would fall not in a single dramatic assault, but bunker by bunker, field by field, as engineer units repeated the same crude but effective tactic. They bulldozed pillboxes shut, buried casemates, and ploughed through dragon's teeth to open lanes for armour. It was dirty, dangerous work, but it worked. Still, the broader story of how the bulldozer became a weapon goes far beyond that single hillside near Roetgen. It traces back to the industrial heart of America, to the philosophy that machines built for peace could be adapted for war, and that ingenuity, not ideology, would determine the fate of Europe. The bulldozer's engine had barely cooled when Colonel Eugene Stubbs of the Dread Armoured Division arrived to inspect the scene. The bunker, once part of the West Wall's proud forward line, now resembled a burial mound. The American soldiers stood around it, silent, their faces splattered with mud. Stubbs crouched, pressed a glove to the packed earth, and smiled faintly. "Looks like we've found ourselves a new weapon," he said. No one laughed. They were too tired, too wet, and too aware of how close the fight had come. But word spread quickly. Within hours, other engineer platoons were modifying bulldozers, welding scrap armor, cutting out viewing slits, and preparing for their own assaults. By dusk, the phrase "dozer tactics" had begun circulating across the division, half joke, half revelation. The bulldozer was never designed to fight, yet war has a way of bending purpose. In the weeks that followed the breakthrough at Roetgen, the American Einst Army continued pushing into the Aachen sector. The Siegfried Line, though often overstated in propaganda, still posed a deadly problem. Countless interlinked pillboxes and gun emplacements guarding narrow forest approaches. Traditional tank attacks were suicidal. Infantry charges cost blood by the minute. But an armoured bulldozer, backed by suppressive fire, could approach, push soil over the apertures, and suffocate the defenders without firing a shot. Lieutenant Harold Cross of the 1106th Engineer Group recorded in his diary on der 28. September 1944. "We began to treat the bulldozer like a rifle, only it fired silence, the silence that comes when a bunker stops shooting. Soon, field commanders were requesting bulldozers by name. Requests that once read, 'Send tanks,' now read, 'Send dosers.' Each new encounter along the Siegfried Line confirmed what few in the War Department had anticipated. Sometimes the simplest tools used boldly could outmatch the most elaborate fortifications. Improvisation, however, only lasts so long before the army makes it official. In mid-October 1944, the 1st U.S. Army's Engineer Section issued a bulletin titled "Methods for Neutralizing Concrete Fortifications." Buried in the third paragraph was an unexpected line: "When demolitions fail, employ armoured bulldozers to seal firing ports and entrances. Such action may prove the most rapid means of reducing enemy resistance." That sentence marked a quiet revolution. A civilian construction machine had been officially sanctioned as a front-line assault tool. Engineer units began attaching steel cages over driver seats, salvaged from damaged Shermans or cut from bridge girders. Some dozers mounted sandbags or wooden panels, others carried spare track links as makeshift armor. It wasn't elegant, but it worked. The 291st Combat Engineer Battalion, already famous for its work during the Battle of the Bulge months later, tested these modified bulldozers under fire near Stolberg. They found that even under sustained machine gun fire, the vehicles could reach and seal a bunker in under 4 minutes. To the Germans inside, it was psychological warfare. One survivor of the 246th Volksgrenadier Division later recalled, "We fired until the slit was gone. Then we sat in the dark and felt the earth pressing in. It was like being buried alive while still breathing." For the Americans, it was grim efficiency. The bulldozer had become a coffin maker. To understand why this adaptation spread so quickly, one must grasp the mentality of the U.S. Army Engineer Corps. Unlike German engineers, whose work was often constrained by centralized directives, American engineers thrived on initiative. Their commanders were trained to solve, not to wait. A field engineer manual from 1943 declared, "Every obstacle has a face. Your duty is to find it." That philosophy guided everything they did in Europe. When an obstacle appeared, They didn't ask whether they were allowed to overcome it, they simply did. In France, that meant bridging rivers faster than maps could be updated. In Belgium, it meant converting civilian trucks into mine rollers, and in Germany, it meant turning bulldozers into weapons. Captain Robert T. Walker, who oversaw engineer operations during the drive on Aachen, put it bluntly in his after-action report. Learned that concrete could be shot at all day, or buried in 5 minutes. I prefer the latter. The bulldozer's value wasn't just mechanical, it was psychological. It symbolized the American approach to warfare itself. Pragmatic, unsentimental, and endlessly adaptive. Across the line, German officers were dumbfounded. Captured documents from the 353rd Infantry Division show that local commanders initially believed the Americans were using special siege tanks. When prisoners later described them as Baumaschinen construction machines, the reports were dismissed as misunderstanding or propaganda. The Wehrmacht had long prided itself on technical superiority. German tanks, guns, and fortifications were often masterpieces of engineering precision. Yet that very obsession with perfection sometimes blinded them to the crude brilliance of improvisation. A post-war German analysis, Heeresgruppe B Engineer Report No. 12, noted ruefully, the enemy's genius lies not in inventing new weapons, but in finding new uses for old ones. In the Siegfried Line's pillboxes, that lesson came too late. By October 1944, the city of Aachen, Hitler's symbolic gateway to the Reich, was under siege. Street by street, block by block, American infantry fought to clear snipers and machine gun nests entrenched in basements and ruins. The engineers followed close behind, bulldozers clanking through rubble. When artillery collapsed entire buildings across narrow streets, dozers cleared the debris to let tanks pass. When German bunkers blocked intersections, the same machines that had once built American highways buried them under their own foundations. Lieutenant General Charles Corlett, commander of the 90th Corps, later remarked, "You can trace our line of advance by the sound of the dozers. They never stopped." By the time Aachen fell on October 21, more than 70 armoured bulldozers had been deployed in direct combat roles. It was a new chapter in military history, one that neither side had foreseen. Behind every machine was a man. Corporal James Red Anderson, whose bulldozer had sealed the first bunker near Roetgen, survived the war. He received a Bronze Star for extraordinary heroism in operations against enemy fortifications. In an interview years later, Anderson recalled, "When you're behind that blade, you don't think about killing. You think about pushing, dirt, stone, whatever's in front of you, the rest just happens." His words captured the strange intersection of engineering and violence that defined the modern battlefield. The bulldozer had no gun, no turret, no crew beyond one man, yet it could decide the fate of dozens. What made this episode remarkable wasn't merely the success of a machine, but the mindset it represented. America's industrial power during World War II was vast 297, 000 aircraft, 88, 000 tanks, 2,4 million trucks. But more than output, it was adaptability that won the war. Factories that once produced tractors now turned out tanks and bulldozers in parallel. The Caterpillar Company of Peoria, Illinois, increased production by over 80% between 1942 and 1944, supplying not only the U.S. Army but also the British and Canadian forces. Many of these bulldozers were never meant for frontline use. Yet, through field modifications, they became as critical as any tank or gun in breaching the German frontier. When Eisenhower toured the front in late 1944, an aide reportedly remarked that the engineers had turned plowshares into weapons. Eisenhower nodded and replied, "That's the American way we build things to destroy barriers." The Siegfried Line was conceived as an answer to France's Maginot Line, a monument to static defence, in an age that was already moving beyond it. But in 1944, the irony deepened. It was destroyed not by heavier guns or clever tactics, but by the very principle it defied: mobility, flexibility, and labor. Concrete, no matter how thick, cannot withstand imagination. And imagination, once given an engine and a blade, will always find a way forward. German soldiers came to dread the growl of the bulldozer as much as the whistle of shells. For them, it meant not bombardment or fire, but something more inexorable burial. After the war, when Europe began rebuilding, bulldozers once again became symbols of creation. The same machines that had buried pillboxes now cleared ruins for schools, roads, and factories. In Germany, Caterpillar bulldozers arrived under the Marshall Plan, painted bright yellow, a jarring contrast to the mud-stained, armoured beasts that had once advanced under fire. Engineers who had used them in war found themselves operating them in peace. One veteran of the 84th Infantry Division put it best: "I used a dozer to seal Germans in 44 and to dig their new foundations in 48. Either way, it was about moving forward." The bulldozer's dual identity destroyer and builder mirrored the 20th century itself, a civilization capable of both ruin and renewal through the same hands, the same steel. The Germans had imagined their line eternal, an unbreachable monument to military science, but they hadn't imagined an enemy that would bring construction equipment to a gunfight. The bulldozer, humble and loud, taught the world a simple lesson that echoed far beyond the Siegfried Line. Innovation is not always the creation of new machines, but the recreation of purpose. In the end, what crushed the pillboxes wasn't just metal or horsepower, it was the refusal to accept limits. Where others saw obstacles, the engineers saw possibilities. And in that muddy, rain-soaked autumn of 1944, possibility had a blade. The autumn rain along the German border had hardened into sleet by November 1944. The forested ridges of the Roetgen were silent, except for the constant groan of engines buried under ESO, tarps, bulldozers, tank retrievers, half-tracks, all coated in mud so thick it turned khaki into grey. For the men of the 121st Combat Engineer Battalion, this was not a campaign, it was an endurance test. The ground was soaked, the air freezing, and every road seemed mined or cratered. They no longer felt like soldiers. They felt like diggers trapped between two worlds, one they were trying to destroy, and one they had to rebuild each morning just to keep moving. Private First Class Eddie Vasquez had once poured concrete for irrigation ditches back home in New Mexico. He could recall the smell of wet earth after rain, the way the shovel's handle felt warm from the sun. Now, in the cold belly of Europe, the same smell of earth came mixed with smoke and iron. His shovel was steel grey, and the ground he moved buried men instead of seeds. The engineers had been ordered to open a route through the Roetgen toward Deurne, a path blocked by collapsed bunkers, felled trees, and a stream of German fire from unseen pillboxes. Infantry had been pinned down for days. Once again, the bulldozers were called forward. The men muttered a familiar line, half grim, half proud: "When the grunts can't go through, send the dozer." Unlike the sweeping tank battles of Normandy, the Roetgen forest turned the war into an engineer's nightmare. Each yard of progress required clearing mines, filling craters, or dragging timber. The front was measured not in miles, but in feet of usable road. Captain Leo Kaufmann, a civil engineer before the war, commanded the platoon. He wrote in his small waterproof notebook, "We are no longer fighting men, we are fighting mud, distance, and time." The bulldozer became their only constant companion. Its engine never complained, though its drivers aged years in weeks. Visibility was near zero. Each push through the sludge risked mines or artillery spotting. One evening, as Vasquez and his team prepared another night push, a shell exploded just ahead. Shrapnel tore through the side armour of their Dezeben. The driver, Sergeant Elmer Cole, survived only because the shell struck a plate salvaged from a burned-out Panzer. When they dug him out, he was still gripping the controls, muttering, "Keep pushing, keep pushing." They welded more scrap to the sides that night, old boiler doors from a ruined factory, and christened the machine St. Elmer. Psychologically, the war did something strange to these men. They were neither warriors nor labourers, but something in between destroyers, with the skill of builders. Captain Kaufmann noticed how his men instinctively repaired things they had just wrecked. A bridge rebuilt minutes after blowing another apart, a shelter carved from the same rubble they had created. He described it as the curse of the craftsman. "You spend your life learning to build things straight," he told Vasquez one night, "and then they hand you dynamite and tell you that destruction is now construction." The irony haunted many engineers long after the guns fell silent. The bulldozer was the perfect metaphor for their emotional armour. Its blade concealed the man behind it, reduced fear to function. Inside that narrow compartment, drivers felt paradoxically safe, not because they were invulnerable, but because they were busy. Purpose was protection. Corporal Red Anderson, now assigned to the 1121. Group near Monschau, described it later. "You stop thinking about right or wrong when you're pushing dirt. You just think about the next foot of ground. That's how you stay sane." It was true. In the Roetgen, sanity depended on keeping your mind inside the machine and your conscience somewhere far behind the blade. By December, the Allied command had one obsession: reach the Rhine. To do that, roads were life. Engineers led the way, bulldozers clearing, graders levelling, pontoon teams bridging rivers under fire. When the German counter-offensive, the Battle of the Bulge, erupted on December 16, the engineers were caught at the tip of the storm. In the chaos of the Ardennes, bulldozers performed miracles. At Saint-Vith, they blocked crossroads by piling debris into instant barricades. At Malmedy, they carved defensive ditches faster than infantry could dig with shovels. Some were even used to push snow into berms, turning open fields into tank traps overnight. The Germans expected to fight soldiers. They found themselves fighting machines that built walls faster than artillery could tear them down. During the darkest hours of the Bulge, one episode became legend among engineers. On Christmas Eve 1944, near the town of Hotten, a small detachment of the 51st Engineer Combat Battalion held a crossroads against an approaching German column. With no heavy weapons, they turned to what they had: 2 bulldozers and a truckload of explosives. They drove the dozers into the intersection, blades down, engines roaring. As the first German armoured cars appeared, the engineers detonated charges that collapsed the road behind them, trapping the lead vehicles. Then, while the enemy fired wildly, the bulldozers pushed burning wrecks into a barrier of twisted metal and flame. By morning, the road remained closed, and the German advance had been delayed long enough for reinforcements to arrive. After the war, when journalists asked how they'd managed it, Sergeant Frank Hobson simply said, "We built the one thing every army needs most time." For all their courage, engineer losses were high. Driving a bulldozer under fire was among the most dangerous jobs in the European theatre. The vehicles were slow, tall, and irresistible targets for artillery. Records from the U.S. Army's 1945 Engineer Report list over 900 bulldozers damaged or destroyed in action, roughly 1 in every 3 deployed. Yet replacements always arrived, often faster than men. Factories in Illinois and Pennsylvania sent crated D-7s across the Atlantic like lifeboats for progress. When one was lost, another appeared within days. War had industrialized even its resilience. By March 1945, the impossible had become routine. At Remagen, when the Ludendorff Bridge was captured intact, engineers swarmed to reinforce it under constant German bombardment. When that bridge later collapsed, bulldozers cleared twisted steel from the banks to make way for new pontoon bridges. From the air, the scene looked like an industrial miracle smoke. Cranes, dozers, and boats converging in a choreography of purpose. Colonel Paul Barton of the 9th Engineer Command wrote in his field log, "It looked less like war and more like a construction site that refused to die." By late March, the first American tanks were rolling across the Rhine on floating bridges built by men who, only months before, had been farmers, mechanics, or civil engineers. And always, in the background, The dozers pushed clearing, levelling, erasing the old boundaries of the Reich one embankment at a time. For the Germans, the bulldozer had become an omen of collapse. In propaganda leaflets, dropped by Allied planes, caricatures showed the Reich's mighty concrete walls being buried under mountains of dirt labelled American industry. A captured Wehrmacht officer near Koblenz told interrogators, "We stopped fearing your bombs. We feared your machines that never stopped building." That single line captured the transformation perfectly. The war had begun as a contest of destruction, tanks against tanks, bombers against cities, but it was ending as a contest of endurance and creation. Whoever could build faster, adapt faster, and repair faster would prevail. When the 121st Engineers reached the Rhine, Vasquez stood beside his machine and watched the sunset reflect off the water. He could hardly believe how far they had come from Normandy's beaches to Germany's rivers. His dozer's blade was bent, its engine coughing, smoke, its yellow paint long buried under mud and soot. He ran his hand along the metal and thought of home, of irrigation ditches, of the sound of water flowing through channels he had built. The river before him was larger than any ditch he had ever dug. And yet the principle was the same. You move earth to make passage. Build or die, Kaufmann said quietly beside him. That's all war ever is. After victory in Europe, the engineers were among the first to begin reconstruction. They filled craters, repaired roads, and cleared mines. Bulldozers once painted in camouflage were repainted yellow, their blades polished for peace. In ruined German towns, local civilians watched as American soldiers used the same machines that had buried pillboxes to reopen schools and hospitals. Eddie Vasquez stayed in Europe for a year after the war, part of the occupation force. He worked with German labourers rebuilding bridges across the Ruhr. One of them, a former Luftwaffe mechanic, approached him one afternoon and asked cautiously, "Was it true? You used these things as weapons?" Vasquez smiled and nodded. "Only when we had to. Mostly we just used them to keep moving." The bulldozer's legacy lived on. In Korea, Vietnam, and the Persian Gulf, armoured bulldozers became standard battlefield tools, clearing mines, breaking defences, and even breaching enemy lines. The lessons of 1944 never faded. The US Army engineer motto, "Essayons, let us try," took on new meaning after the war. It became not just a phrase but a philosophy, that progress, however brutal, begins with the courage to try something no one else would dare. The Germans never imagined that the weapon to breach their vaunted wall would not roar with guns, but hum with the steady patience of a diesel engine. In that irony lies one of the war's quiet truths, that the line between builder and warrior is drawn not by what a man holds in his hands, but by what he chooses to do with it. In every war, there comes a moment when innovation outruns ideology. For Germany, it was the moment their concrete met the American bulldozer. For America, it was the moment construction became conquest. The blade that buried pillboxes also paved the way to victory, and when the noise of battle faded, it returned to what it had always been, a tool for creation, proof that even in the ruins of war, humanity's first instinct is to build again. The Rhine lay behind them, wide and silent. The bulldozers, scarred and rusted, sat idle for the first time in months. The engineers stood beside their machines, unsure what to do with their hands, now that there was nothing left to build or break. Captain Kaufmann wrote his final entry. "We crossed not just a river, but the limit of what men can endure." Eddie Vasquez watched the water slide past the wreck of a bridge they had once repaired. He felt no triumph, only a deep, exhausted calm. The blade that had carved through Europe was still caked in the soil of 3 nations. At night, the men talked softly about home farms, workshops, classrooms, lives where noise meant life, not death. Someone joked that if you gave them 2 months and enough fuel, they could rebuild Germany themselves. No one laughed. They probably could. When orders came to return the machines to depot, Vasquez hesitated. He reached out and traced his name, scratched faintly into the dozer's hood. The metal was cold, but it felt alive, as if it, too, remembered. In April, when the war finally ended, the engineers were already rebuilding bridges for the same people they had fought. Children waved as the bulldozers rumbled through ruined streets, clearing paths for wagons and bread trucks. Kaufman watched it all and murmured, "The same hands that destroy can heal. The trick is remembering which they were made for." The men nodded, engines humming like distant thunder. And so the war ended not with an explosion, but with the call, the low, steady growl of a bulldozer, the sound of soldiers learning, once again, how to build. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.